Family, lean in for a moment, because what I'm about to say is not the message you grew up hearing. It's not the message people celebrate, and it's definitely not the message the world wants you to follow. But it is the message God has been whispering to somebody in this room, somebody watching, somebody who's been carrying battles that were never theirs to fight. God said, focus on yourself and stay silent. I know. Everything in you wants to clap back, explain yourself, defend your name, prove your worth, show people they were wrong about you. But God told me to tell you, this season is not about proving anything to anybody. This season is about protecting the version of you He's trying to grow. Some of you are exhausted because you've been fighting in rooms God never sent you into. You've been responding to voices God never told you to answer. You've been leaking energy into situations that don't even deserve your breath. But God said, daughter, son, if you would just shift your focus inward, if you would just get quiet enough to hear me again, I will handle what you can't. I will speak where you won't. I will expose what you can't see. I will elevate you without you having to announce anything. This is the part of the journey nobody talks about, the silent season, the healing season, the rebuilding season, the season where God hides you so He can restore you. Silence is not weakness, it is divine strategy. When God calls you into a season of silence, He isn't diminishing your power, He is redirecting it. Most people misunderstand silence because they connect it to surrender or defeat. But in the kingdom of God, silence can become one of your greatest weapons. Silence is the place where clarity begins to rise, where your emotions stop leading and your spirit starts recognizing what God has been trying to reveal. There are battles in life that require your voice, but there are also battles that require your restraint. And learning the difference is one of the most powerful spiritual disciplines you will ever develop. Silence does not mean you are ignoring the storm. It means you refuse to let the storm dictate your identity. It means you trust that God sees what you see, hears what you hear, and knows what they said, but you choose to remain grounded instead of reactive because you know your restraint is partnered with His response. Silence is strategic because it keeps you from wasting energy on people who thrive on your reaction. Some individuals don't want healing. They want noise. They don't want growth. They want drama. They don't want accountability. They want chaos. And one of the ways God protects your spirit is by pulling you back from environments where your presence would only feed dysfunction. When you choose silence, you are no longer feeding the narrative others tried to create about you. You are no longer giving access to people who only want to drain you. Silence forces the truth to surface without you having to speak it. There is a supernatural unveiling that takes place when you stop defending yourself and let God do the revealing. There are seasons when God will tell you to be silent, not because He wants you hidden, but because He wants you focused. Silence pulls you out of unnecessary conversations so you can finally hear the conversation God has been trying to have with you. It's hard to catch divine instruction when your mind is cluttered with opinions, assumptions, pressure, and noise. Silence becomes the clearing in the forest, the place where revelation can finally land. When you stop responding to distractions, you start receiving direction. God uses silence to sharpen your sensitivity to Him. He uses silence to reset your internal compass. He uses silence to prepare you for the next stage of your assignment. Not only does silence protect you spiritually, it protects your progress. When you talk too much in the wrong environment, you sabotage the very thing God is trying to build. Not everyone deserves access to what God is stirring in your spirit. Some people cannot handle your vision, your growth, your evolution, or your healing. And if you share prematurely, they will try to shrink what God is expanding. Silence is strategy because it allows God to work in you without interference. The seed grows in the dark for a reason. Some of your greatest transformations will happen in the rooms where no one sees you and no one hears you except God. Silence becomes the incubator for your next season. Silence is also a test of trust. God will sometimes let accusations fly, let misunderstandings linger, let people talk, let situations look unfair, not because he wants you to suffer, but because he wants to see if you can trust him enough to stay quiet while he defends you. It is the discipline of letting God finish what people try to distort. It takes strength to walk away from an argument you know you could win. It takes maturity to resist the urge to justify yourself. It takes spiritual confidence to say nothing when your flesh wants to say everything. Silence is not weakness, it is alignment. It is you saying, God, I could speak, but I choose to trust your voice over mine. That is power, that is authority, that is faith lived out loud, even when your mouth stays closed. Majesty, to remember that space and time are both the silence keeps you from delaying what God is trying to accelerate. Every time you respond to something beneath your calling, you slow down your momentum. Every time you stop to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you waste strength that could be pushing you forward. Silence keeps your pace in the hands of God instead of the opinions of others. Silence frees you from the trap of trying to manage every perception. Silence keeps you emotionally sober when life tries to intoxicate you with frustration, anger, or retaliation. Silence builds resilience where wounds once lived. It trains your spirit to rely on wisdom instead of impulse. Silence can also be the bridge between who you were and who you are becoming. When you're in transition, you don't always have the language for what God is doing. You don't have the vocabulary for your healing yet. You don't have the words for your new identity yet. Silence becomes the sacred space where God forms your new voice. Before God ever sends you into a new season to speak, he often takes you through a season where you say nothing so he can shape what your voice will carry next. Silence is the molding stage, the refining stage, the strengthening stage. Silence is where God strips away the need to be validated, affirmed, understood, or applauded by people who were never assigned to your destiny in the first place. Silence reveals who is truly connected to your calling. When you stop talking, the people who were only there for what they could take will disappear. The people who loved the old version of you, the version that over-explained, overgave, over-forgave, over-permission, will become uncomfortable with your quiet strength. Silence exposes motives. Silence exposes loyalty. Silence exposes alignment. When God tells you to stay silent, he's not just protecting your heart. He's exposing the hearts of those around you. You learn quickly who respects your boundaries, who honors your space, and who only valued you when they could control you. Silence becomes a filter that separates the wheat from the weeds in your relationship. Divine silence is also where God begins to restore your inner authority. Sometimes you talk too much because you doubt yourself. You argue because you feel threatened. You explain because you feel insecure. God brings you into silence so you can confront the parts of you that depend on people for validation. Silence teaches you that you don't need external confirmation to be who God called you to be. Silence reconnects you to your identity in God instead of your identity in people's opinions. Silence grows you from the inside out. Silence rebuilds your confidence. Silence detoxes your spirit from the need to please. Silence gives you permission to be whole without apology. Silence is also a response to spiritual warfare. Not every attack deserves your attention. Not every lie deserves your breath. Not every distraction deserves your presence. Silence is warfare because it starves the enemy of the reaction he expected. When you refuse to respond, you break the cycle he tried to trap you in. Silence says, I see what you're doing, but I'm not coming down to fight at a level beneath my assignment. Silence keeps you on the battlefield God called you to instead of the one the enemy tried to drag you into. Silence is confidence in God's covering. It is faith that he will vindicate, elevate, correct, uncover, restore, and settle what concerns you. Silence positions you for divine revelation. When the noise quiets, your discernment sharpens. You begin to see what you couldn't see when everything around you was loud. You begin to feel God's guidance in places you once felt confusion. Silence makes room for insight, for wisdom, for creativity, for healing. Silence opens the door for God to pour clarity into the spaces that chaos once occupied. Silence is not empty, it is full. Full of growth, full of answers, full of transformation. Silence ultimately becomes the foundation of spiritual maturity. It shows that you understand timing, that you trust God's process, and that you're willing to let him author your story without trying to edit every chapter. Silence reveals your readiness for the next level. Silence reveals your spiritual discipline. Silence reveals your willingness to release control. Silence is the bridge God uses to take you from reaction to revelation, from pain to purpose, from noise to alignment. Focusing on yourself creates space for God to move. There comes a moment in your spiritual journey where God gently but firmly pulls your attention away from everything and everyone around you and turns it inward. Not inward in a selfish way, not inward in a prideful way, but inward in a healing, clarifying, transformative way. When God says focus on yourself, he is not telling you to abandon people or disconnect from your purpose. He is inviting you into a sacred recalibration, a moment where the noise of the world fades and the work of God becomes personal again. Most people were taught to pour out endlessly, to be strong for everybody, to be available for everything. But what they were never taught is that constant pouring without replenishing leads to spiritual dehydration. Focusing on yourself allows God to refill the parts of you that have been running on empty for far too long. There are seasons when your spirit begins to feel stretched, tired, overwhelmed, or unclear. And instead of giving you another assignment, God gives you a mirror. He gives you a moment to pause, to breathe, to confront the areas you've been avoiding, to strengthen the parts of you that have been weakening, and to rediscover the voice within you that has been overshadowed by the demands of life. Focusing on yourself allows God to address the wounds you've covered with productivity, the fears you hid beneath your responsibilities, the insecurities you dressed up as confidence, and the pain you attempted to pray through without ever truly healing. God cannot move where you will not make room. And sometimes the way you make room is by turning your attention away from what's happening around you and choosing to deal with what's happening within you. When you shift your focus inward, you begin to recognize the ways you've been carrying things that don't belong to you. You start to see the emotional load that came from expectations you never agreed to, the exhaustion that came from trying to be the answer for everyone, the stress that came from living a life that didn't match your calling. Focusing on yourself helps you discern where you've been spiritually misaligned. It exposes the habits that drain your joy, the relationships that interrupt your peace, the patterns that sabotage your growth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. God uses self-focus as a gentle revelation, an unveiling of what needs to be strengthened, what needs to be surrendered, and what needs to be released so you can finally step into the wholeness he intended for you. Focusing on yourself also separates you from distractions. The enemy doesn't always show up as danger. Sometimes he shows up as noise. A distraction could be a person, a pattern, a problem, or a pressure that constantly pulls your attention away from your inner healing. When God calls you to focus on yourself, he is pulling you out of the swirl of distractions so you can gain clarity again. You begin to recognize that not every conversation deserves your voice, not every crisis demands your involvement, not every conflict requires your presence. Focusing on yourself teaches you to guard your peace with the same intensity you once guarded your reputation. You stop being available for problems you didn't create and battles you were never assigned to fight. You reclaim your mental space, your emotional energy, and your spiritual focus. And as you do, God begins to move in places you didn't even realize had been blocked. There are people who depend on you being distracted because your distraction keeps you from growing beyond their expectations. There are environments that thrive on your overcommitment because as long as you are pouring into them, they never have to take responsibility for their own growth. But when you shift your focus inward, some individuals will get uncomfortable because your healing confronts their dependency. Suddenly, you are no longer accessible in the way they were used to. You start saying no where you once said yes. You start creating boundaries where you once tolerated chaos. You start choosing rest where you once chose self-neglect. And while it may confuse some people, it liberates your spirit. Focusing on yourself frees you from the version of you that was created by obligation, pressure, fear, and survival. And it allows God to introduce you to the version of you He always intended. Focusing on yourself also reveals the strengths you forgot you had. When you slow down, when you pause long enough to breathe, when you give yourself permission to exist outside of constant productivity, you begin to rediscover your own gifts. You start to see your creativity again, your resilience again, your anointing again. You recognize that you are not defined by what you do, but by who God formed you to be. Many people lose themselves trying to keep up with expectations, but when God calls you back to yourself, He is calling you back to purpose. He is calling you back to identity. He is calling you back to truth. You cannot walk in destiny while disconnected from self-awareness, and focusing on yourself becomes the gateway to clarity about where God is leading you next. It is in the quiet internal work that God begins to download new ideas, new direction, new vision, new wisdom. You cannot hear your next instruction while your life is drowning in noise. When you turn your focus inward, the volume of outside voices lowers and the voice of God rises. He begins to show you what needs to shift, where you need to go, what you need to let go of, and what you need to embrace. God moves most clearly in the lives of those who are willing to pause long enough to listen. As you focus on yourself, you stop rushing your life and start experiencing it. You stop reacting to everything and start discerning everything. You stop being led by fear and start being led by faith. Focusing on yourself also teaches you the value of emotional honesty. You cannot heal what you pretend doesn't hurt. Many people spend years hiding their wounds beneath their assignments, pretending they're fine because they don't want to burden anyone or because vulnerability feels unsafe. But when you stop and look inward, you finally give yourself the permission to say, I'm hurting, I'm tired, I'm confused, or I need help. And it is in that raw honesty that God can begin the mending process. He meets you at the point of your truth. He cannot fix the version of you that hides behind strength. He heals the version of you that is willing to be authentic. Focusing on yourself helps you shed the layers of emotional armor you had to wear for survival and allows God to tend to the parts of you that you've been afraid to expose. When you focus on yourself, you also learn to stop seeking validation from places that were never designed to affirm you. You stop measuring your worth through the lens of other people's opinions. You stop basing your identity on how well you perform, fix, help, or serve others. You begin to realize that God loves you for who you are, not for what you give. And when you internalize that truth, you detach from the pressure of impressing people. You no longer need applause to feel valuable. You no longer need approval to feel secure. You become grounded in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are in God. And that internal confidence becomes a foundation no external circumstance can shake. Focusing on yourself makes room for God to prune what has been hindering your growth. Sometimes the reason you feel stuck isn't because God isn't moving. It's because you haven't slowed down enough to let Him remove what's blocking your progress. Maybe it's a habit that keeps trapping you in cycles. Maybe it's an old mindset that keeps lowering your potential. Maybe it's a relationship that drains more than it gives. Maybe it's fear that has been masquerading as wisdom. When you focus inward, you can finally see the roots of what's been holding you back. And once you see it, God can begin to uproot it. The pruning process can be uncomfortable, but it is necessary. God removes so he can restore. He takes away so he can strengthen. He empties so he can pour more. As you focus on yourself, you begin to realize how much you've ignored your own needs. You start to honor your rest, your mental health, your spiritual grounding, your emotional well-being. You begin to see that taking care of yourself is not selfish. It is stewardship. You are a vessel, and God cannot pour through a vessel that is cracked and neglected. When you honor your own well-being, you become stronger, clearer, wiser, and more aligned with your purpose. You cannot serve effectively from a place of emptiness. You cannot love fully from a place of depletion. You cannot walk boldly from a place of brokenness. Focusing on yourself fills the gaps you've been functioning with for years. Focusing on yourself creates the environment where God can rebuild you from the inside out. It makes space for restoration, space for clarity, space for healing, space for strength, space for divine alignment. You step back from the rush of life and let God move in the quiet places. You give him the room to reshape what life tried to break. You allow him to breathe fresh wind into weary places. You create the internal openness that invites transformation. And once God begins to move within you, everything around you begins to shift as well. God handles what you release to him. There's a point in every believer's life where God calls them to surrender, not because he wants to take something away, but because he wants to show what he can do with the things you've been trying to carry alone. We often convince ourselves that we can fix it, manage it, figure it out, control it, or hold it together long enough for things to make sense. But the truth is, some battles don't move until you let go. Some storms don't calm until you surrender the wheel. Some burdens don't lift until you stop gripping them with fear and start trusting God with faith. Release is not giving up. Release is handing it over. Release is saying, God, this is heavier than I am, but it is not heavier than you. Release is the point where heaven begins to intervene because you finally stop interfering. Many of us struggle with release because we have been trained to depend on ourselves. We were taught to push through, hold on, force solutions, and make things happen even when our spirit was exhausted. But release requires a different kind of strength. Release requires humility. Release requires trust. Release requires the ability to admit that you cannot fix what only God can repair. When you cling to something God is asking you to release, you trap yourself in battles meant to be fought by him. When you let go, you open the door for divine movement. God cannot work in what you insist on controlling. Release is the invitation for God to step in. God handles what you release, but sometimes you don't realize how much you're carrying until God asks you to put it down. You don't see the emotional weight attached to that relationship. You don't see the mental strain attached to that responsibility. You don't see the spiritual pressure attached to trying to be everything for everyone. Release helps you recognize the things that have been draining you silently. God doesn't tell you to release something because he wants you weak. He tells you to release it because it is making you weak. Release restores strength. Release brings clarity. Release untangles your spirit from the burdens that were never yours. Release is also a test of faith. It is easy to trust God with what feels manageable, but trusting him with what feels impossible requires courage. Release is not just letting go of the struggle. It is letting go of the timeline, the outcome, the explanation, the expectations, and the desire to control what you can't see. When you release something into God's hands, the outcome stops being your responsibility. What used to keep you up at night becomes something God is working on while you sleep. What used to consume your thoughts becomes something God is handling behind the scenes. Release is the shift from anxiety to assurance, from fear to faith, from striving to surrender. There are situations in life where your effort will only prolong your pain. Some things cannot be fixed through force. They can only be transformed through surrender. Release is not passive. It is spiritual participation. It is you stepping out of the way so God can step in. It is you saying, I trust your wisdom over my worry, your plan over my pressure, your timing over my impatience. Release is not weakness. Release is worship. It acknowledges God's sovereignty. It acknowledges his authority. It acknowledges his ability to handle what overwhelms you. God handles what you release because he sees what you cannot see. He sees the motives behind people's actions. He sees the traps the enemy set ahead. He sees the outcomes that your fear blinds you from. When you release things to God, he begins to rearrange circumstances according to his divine knowledge instead of your limited understanding. The very thing you thought was falling apart might actually be God pulling apart the pieces that were harming you. The thing you thought you were losing might be the thing God needed to remove for your protection. Release gives God permission to redirect your path without resistance. Some of the greatest breakthroughs in your life will come after the moment you release something you were terrified to let go of. God often asks you to release what you're holding because he wants to place something greater in your hands. But if your hands are full of stress, fear, control, and expectations, there is no room left for blessing. Release creates capacity. Release creates spiritual breathing room. Release clears the clutter so God can pour new strength, new vision, new relationships, new opportunities, and new levels of purpose. What feels like loss in the moment may actually be the clearing needed for your next season. Many people delay their healing because they fear release. They stay in situations that drain them because the familiar feels safer than the unknown. They hold tightly to relationships God already closed. They cling to plans God already redirected. They hold on to identities God is trying to grow them out of. Release is scary because it requires trust in what you cannot see yet. But when God is leading you, release is not the end. It is the doorway. Every time you release something, you make space for divine alignment to take place. God does not ask you to let go without having something prepared for the other side of your surrender. Release is not a one-time act. It is a daily spiritual discipline. Every day you have to choose to release your worries, your fears, your frustrations, your disappointments, your need to be understood, your need to control, your desire to rush God. Release says, I cannot carry this alone, and I don't have to. Release lifts the pressure off your shoulders and transfers it onto God's. When you release it to him, you begin to walk lighter, think clearer, sleep deeper, and live freer. Release unlocks peace where anxiety once lived. It unlocks clarity where confusion once lingered. It unlocks strength where exhaustion once weighed heavy. God handles what you release because he is faithful. He does not take what you give him and leave it untouched. He takes it, transforms it, heals it, restores it, or removes it. Whatever is necessary for your growth. God takes the broken pieces you release and builds something stronger. He takes the tears you release and waters the next season with them. He takes the pain you release and turns it into wisdom. He takes the disappointment you release and turns it into redirection. Nothing placed in God's hands stays the same. His hands are hands of transformation. There are situations where you will not see movement until you surrender. You will not see healing until you release the bitterness. You will not see growth until you release the old version of yourself. You will not see clarity until you release the confusion you've been holding. You will not see the next step until you release your obsession with controlling every outcome. Release is the key that unlocks divine acceleration. God moves quickly where surrender is present. God moves freely where trust is active. Release also strengthens your spiritual identity. It teaches you to stop defining yourself by what you carry. Some people believe their worth is connected to how much they can handle, but God wants you to know your worth is connected to who He created you to be, not to how strong you pretend to be. Release teaches you that you don't have to be the hero of every story, the fixer of every situation.